Today is Friday, July 25th, 2025, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, I have no question for you today. I will just tell everybody that my new grandson is big.
That should really trump anything I would say, Mr. Robinson. Congratulations, by the way, to you and your family. That is exciting.
It's funny because my wife and I recognized about 5 years ago that we were starting to notice cute babies again, and we were like, "What's up?" And then we realized we transitioned to the grandchild phase of our lives, and we were so ready for it. And it was all you could hope to be. And it just like it. I just think about the future more and more. Like as he grows, that you can play with him more and do stuff with him and everything. And it's so great. It's hard to explain unless you actually go through it. Because I remember getting married and starting out, grandparents was so far away, and it didn't sound like that fun, and people would wear T-shirts about how great it was to be grandparents and everything. I was like, maybe we'll see.
Well, this will not be our topic today, but I recognize we're missing an opportunity here since it's so fresh on your mind. I do think one of the great things we could do for younger people today is to actually try to communicate a sense of just how much you're going to want to be a grandparent one day.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? To actually invest that into the youth because you don't appreciate it. But
Yeah.
when you get my age, you wish you could go back in time and do so. Maybe, okay, bookmark that.
Yeah,
we'll bookmark that for another topic. We did plan on talking about something else today, though.
All right, let's set it up then. Mr. Smith, you recently ran across an old note that reminded you of some things. What were you reminded of?
Well, I had made a note about a future podcast, and hey, the future is now, as some might say. And I'd forgotten about this, but it hit me just how many dumb lies there are about Jesus, and especially our younger listeners. They have perhaps been covered in more lies about Jesus than anybody. And even though they may not be falling for them, do we know how to answer them? And so I just thought, hey, why don't we, cover lies about Jesus? Because the fact is, you have been lied about Jesus, and we need to know the truth.
Yeah, no, that I loved the topic. Saw the outline. Sounds great. Let's podcast it.
Let's do it. Thanks for hanging around after the music, and I think we ended up just trimming it just there, which is too bad. But Mr. Robinson said something like, "Let's podcast that," and then he said, "Can I say that? Does that make sense?" I think we can. I think you've. Well, no, it's probably a verb by now, but there is the what's the word? The phenomenon of verbing nouns, where you take a noun and turn it into a verb, and a lot of people don't like that. But it goes back. I mean, it's part of the English. We've done that in the English language. Shakespeare, actually, many of our verbs, I say many, but there are a lot of verbs today that were nouns in Shakespeare's day, but Shakespeare totally profitably turned those things into verbs, and now they're a rich part of our language. But
plus, we work in editorial. It's kind of our job to explore where we can go.
Absolutely, we are advancing the English language every day here in the editorial department. All right, lies about Jesus Christ, and some are, to me, more. They're all frustrating. They're all because they're not true, but some in particular because of some of the, I don't know, so how to put it, some of the attitude behind some of them, and how they're not just people making mistakes. Some of them, but they're actively being said with an agenda.
Well, growing up in the church, obviously I was never taught, say for example, I know this is one of the points we're going to get to, that Jesus had long hair, okay? But still, everywhere I ever looked where he was depicted, he had long hair.
Yeah.
And it's hard to shake that. And it still influenced me in the church growing up as an adult, and I would try to, say you're going to pray or something, but anyway.
Or imagine a scene in the New Testament, anything like that.
And it was always the fake hippie Jesus.
Yeah.
And it took a long time to kind of purge that out, and I would argue that it's still, it's like a virus hiding that can be activated. It's still there.
It's amazing how deep that gets. When we get to that one, that'll be, I think, our second or third one. I got into an argument with a girl in high school about that, so we'll get into that. All right. Before we do, I want to highlight, we actually have a telecast that is very similar in spirit. Mr. Gerald Weston did a Tomorrow's World telecast titled Exposing 5 Myths About Jesus. We'll make sure we add a link to that to the website, but we actually compared, and we're not going over, I don't think, ones that he did. I think he goes through some, and we're going through some. So don't feel like you've already seen it. If you listen to the podcast today, go listen to Mr. Weston's telecast exposing 5 myths about Jesus. But for today, we're going to bring some different ones, some big and some small. Here's the first one. Jesus said nothing about homosexuality or transgenderism. Have you ever heard anybody make that claim, Mr. Robinson, that Jesus just didn't say anything about homosexuality?
I've even heard an expansion of that really the Bible itself does not. Because certain scriptures we would think are really straightforward, they'll have their way. They kind of pick it apart. And
they will work very hard. It is amazing the kind of machinations that they will do to avoid the clear statements. In particular, there was I say article. That's just it. It was kind of a trick. It was a bait and switch. I remember seeing a link on Huffington Post. For those who are familiar with that, it's a very sort of left-leaning politically news source, if you quote unquote.
You're being
news
kind.
Source. Yeah, I am. And they had one of their articles was linked, is right there amongst their recommended articles, and it was said everything Jesus says about homosexuality. Well, you click on the article to read it, and it goes the article, and there's a title, and it's just a big old blank page. I mean, they say no. Well, clearly they're trying to make a point. He didn't say anything about homosexuality. Well, one, that is actually a lie on multiple levels. Well, for one, as we understand, Jesus Christ was the Logos. He was God's spokesman in the Old Testament. And so anything said in the Old Testament on behalf of the God family concerning homosexuality, calling it an abomination, calling it the opposite of God's design, then that's actually Jesus Christ who communicated those words, the one who became Jesus Christ. But we can go explicitly to Matthew 19 and start in verse 4. This is where Jesus Christ is having dialogue with the Pharisees and such about marriage. And he says in Matthew 19 and verse 4, it says, he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. That is a statement about sexuality, and it's a statement about marriage, and it's very much anti-same-sex marriage. It says exactly how God designed marriage to be. And it even has to do with sexuality. Talking about one flesh, the Apostle Paul tried to warn the Corinthians that, look, if you go out and visit a prostitute, you're becoming one flesh with a prostitute. Mm-hmm. He says that's not the way God designed this. You're supposed to be in marriage. So yeah, this is a statement. It's not just about custom. It's about biology and how God designed man and woman. And by saying, it's kind of like saying, marriage is between a man and a woman. It's like, well, you didn't say anything about same-sex marriage. It's like, actually, yes, I did. Didn't you hear me? I said marriage is between a man and a woman. I did say something about that.
Such a great example of how when you already have what you want the answer to be, how you'll reason around things like that.
Yeah, it's very, I'm not trying to insult the entire profession when I say this, but it's very lawyerly, where you're looking to see what hay you can make with the words you're given, what room there is to maneuver for what you want. It's really the very legalistic attitude of the courtroom, where, hey, all these words are my tools. I'm going to do my best to shape the outcome I want. So yeah, it's disingenuous. There might be people who actually do believe in the lie, like sincerely, but that just because you believe it doesn't make it not a lie.
That's right. In its simplest definition, the Bible's actually pretty clear when you put the concepts together that any kind of sexual activity outside of marriage is considered sin.
Right.
And since Christ himself, they're just limited it to a man and a woman, and they have to be married, it kind of really clears things up. There's not to mention the other scriptures that Christ didn't say himself, but inspired others to write, that make it very clear. I probably should have looked that up too. But there's one where not only is it explicit, but it breaks down the categories.
Yeah, and that's actually a point that really can be made, and I say fairly, but it's a point that isn't made enough. And that is that it's very easy to jump on the bandwagon condemning homosexuality, as we should, because it is a sin. Hey, don't do that. God says very plainly, don't do that. But yeah, sex outside of marriage is also a sin. Fornication is also a sin. And it's very easy to condemn the one, but not actually to think about condemning the other, when, you should just focus on doing it right? Be married, and that's where it belongs. So anyway, lie number one, that Jesus said nothing about that topic. I mentioned transgenderism when I said it. Yeah, he made them male and female. That is a biological claim. It wasn't that he just made two people and they could randomly decide where they fit in the order of things. And it is, again, a biological claim because he's talking about their capacity to be able to,
Right.
in theory at least, if there's
Well,
no ill health, they would be able to make children and such.
I've only conducted a few weddings, but in one of them, it was when the whole transgender idea was really bursting onto
Oh,
the
really?
scene.
Really?
Yeah. And I appreciated how in our wedding vows we make it explicit that God created them male and female. And it just hit so much harder in that environment of people trying to normalize the idea that you could switch genders, or there's or you could be no gender. And God, right up front, when he created humanity, made it very clear, and Christ, of course, emphasized that again in his ministry. I might mention 1 Corinthians 6:9, if you would like a little more information on that topic.
Oh,
Let's
look at
look
Mr.
at
Robinson with the additional reference. Very nice.
Should have
Very
looked
nice. Well, hey, y'all got it now. Take a look. Surely you have a Bible in your home. All right, the second lie we wanted to discuss today, Mr. Robinson alluded to at the beginning, and that is that Jesus had long hair like a 1960s hippie. I say 1960s hippie because that's the culture I come from. Is like, hippie Jesus. Look at that. But honestly, these days, long hair on a guy isn't even thought of as a hippie. It's just an option.
Well, it's interesting to me because if you go back and see actual real footage of people from the 50s, man, it was super the haircuts were super short. What's the flat top?
Oh yeah,
and then it really wasn't until the 60s where you started seeing the length on the hair. And the Beatles, I think we've talked about doing a podcast where we talk about in pop influences. The Beatles, I remember watching a clip of the Beatles. They've arrived in America and they're doing a little like impromptu press conference. And one of the reporters asked one of the Beatles, "Does all that hair help you sing?" Which is such a trap question, but it's in the Beatles' hair wasn't even out of control at that time compared
to what we see. That's right. When I was a high school teacher, I had a student with long. He was a guy with long hair, and I remember at some point I remember seeing down the hall a student with red hair. And seeing from behind, and the hair was really long, and I remember thinking, well, it was almost like long hair from a commercial, like a shampoo commercial. It was clean, it was really brushed out, and I thought, well, that is a what a nice set of hair, whatever the hair products were used on that, because it had kind of a shine to it. And turned around, it was actually my student. He normally had it like in some kind of ponytail, but he actually had it out, and it looked just like the hair of a woman in a shampoo commercial. And I thought, man, this guy's got to get his hair cut. But that said, there's not a lot of people that actually say this. I need to be careful when I talk about how it is a lie. But it's not like people going around saying, Jesus had long hair, big protest signs, Jesus had long hair. But it is how you commonly see him depicted. I wouldn't say universally, but it is perhaps the most common depiction that you'll see as Jesus with long hair.
This is not an important point, but not only that, but like effeminate, like weak.
Yeah, not a guy that was actually working with wood and stone. Well, I actually had an argument with a girl that I was dating at the time in high school, back before I knew any better, and was just kind of the going steady sort of guy. And it was towards the end because I was starting to learn the truth. God was opening my mind, and I was starting to learn more. And someone had made a comment around us about Jesus having long hair. And I remember saying, well, no, actually, he didn't. And it was so frustrating. We were at a theater competition, because that's the kind of flavor nerd I was. You'd go to theater and drama competitions. And I'm not trying to say anything mean about her. She was really nice, wonderful gal. But she was actually about to go compete. And we were in some, I don't know, religious school or something. And there was sort of a picture of long-haired Jesus on the wall. And I was probably pretty self-righteous at the time. Hopefully I've toned that down since then. But I remember even making a comment like, I think she was kind of happy it was a religious place. It's like, yeah, but they got those, long-haired Jesus pictures. And she said, well, whether or not he had long hair, I guess that depends what law you believe in. And I remember thinking, well, she was taking a dig. Like, I'm stuck in Old Testament law and she's a New Testament person. When really what was frustrating, which is what we're about to bring out, is we know he didn't, not because of the Old Testament so much, but because of the New Testament. There's a New Testament scripture that highlights that Jesus would not have had long hair, and that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 14 and 15. And that's where Paul is talking about prayer and women and hair lengths and things like that. And he says very plainly in 1 Corinthians 11, 14 through 15, does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her, and her hair is given to her for a covering. This idea that even in Paul's day, they understood that, men don't have long hair. That's one of the many distinctions between male and female. And so the idea that Jesus was walking around with long hair, it's not that it violates an Old Testament restriction, even though you could look at even in the Old Testament when it comes to the temple service in Ezekiel, it does talk about the men having their hair trimmed well. But in this, so it's a New Testament thing that we learn that. That from.
What about those who try to defend it by saying something like, what about the Nazirite vow? What about, Samson? He had long hair.
Yes, that does come up sometimes. In fact, some will even go so far as to say Jesus was also, that he took the same kind of vow that Samson's parents took, that he was the Nazirite vow, because he's called a Nazarene, but though that has to do with his the land to which he was tied. And no, Jesus did not take the Nazirite vow. Well, Samson, it's funny, Samson had long hair as a Nazirite, but he was no good Nazirite, man. He's just drinking and partying and all the rest. So
we could talk about that.
That would be Mr. Robinson has some great Samson kind of notes. But in fact, maybe we have. Have we ever covered Samson and Samuel? I don't know if we have on a podcast.
I don't think specifically, no.
Okay. But no, we know Jesus did not take the Nazirite vow because he actually drank wine, for instance, and you weren't supposed to. The fruit of the grape, if you will, was not supposed to touch your lips as a Nazirite. So he had not taken some kind of Nazirite vow.
Well, here's another thing about the Nazirite vow that people don't understand. So somebody like Samson and Samuel, who was also born under a Nazirite vow, would have ended up having long hair. But most people that took a Nazirite vow, it was temporary. It wasn't your entire life. It was short.
That's
so you
right.
never would have gotten hair that long anyway.
Like if I took, I never thought about that, Robinson. Like if I took the Nazirite vow, if I were an Old Testament guy and I took it right now, well, it's not like suddenly I'm going to have long, luscious locks or something. It's going to grow out. And as my barber was at camp for the past 2, by the way, we should say hello to all the campers that are back. Hey, welcome back. We didn't even happen to say that. Once I got my wife and 2 kiddos back, suddenly I was focused on them. But hey, welcome back, everybody. It's good to have you back.
Get a haircut, man.
Well, boy, do we need one, because for most of us, except for my son Benjamin, who is still here, my wife is our barber. She's cut our hair, since the kids were born and since shortly after we got married.
Well, our resident editorial representative for camp this year, Ben Graham, everybody rest in peace. He's going to get his haircut today at lunch.
Okay, good. Well, good. Well, I know for us, our hair was already kind of looking a little shaggy, but you're so busy kind of helping things prepare for camp. And so with my wife being gone for 2 weeks, or really more than that, man, we were looking pretty bad. So she cut all of her hair last night. You notice, Mr. Robinson, I got my hair cut, so looking decent. But no, the fact that I never thought about that, Mr. Robinson. Thank you very much. It's not like your hair becomes instantly long. It takes time to grow out, and then you would have fulfilled your vow, and then it would have gone back to getting it cut.
And part of completing the vow was you, especially if there was the temple, you would go in and you would have your hair shorn. So they would tend to cut it back pretty short
and start back.
What it seems like.
So anyway, no, Jesus did not have long hair. Like no matter how many statues you see or movies you see, or I'm not saying go watch the movies, but the things that the images that glance your eyes of Jesus looking like a hippie or modern day long hair guy, he did not have long hair like that.
If you'd never seen a depiction of Jesus Christ, and you didn't have your brain wasn't loaded with the idea at all, and you just read the New Testament, you would never come away with the idea that he would have long hair. In fact, he's described as being so average looking that they had to pay Judas to point out who he was, because he kind of just blended in.
He just looked like
else.
everybody else, right? Looked very, very normal, which is another thing they don't often do in theatrical things. They pick somebody who, I remember when I was a kid and didn't know any better, seeing one of those Jesus movies, and the guy they had play him, played like, it looked like he was stoned all the time. Every scene he walked into, he just looked like he's kind of spaced out, and his hair looked different. I mean, in every way, he looked different than everybody else, and just it wasn't accurate. All right. A third lie, and you'll see this amongst your, you might have your more intellectual friends make things like this, where they're kind of want to take the high ground and how they know a little bit more. They respect Jesus. Oh yeah, he was great and everything. But anyway, they'll often say this, that Jesus is not God. He was just a good teacher. He was just a good moral teacher. Maybe even think he went to heaven or something. But regardless, he was not God, and that's a lie. We have a telecast. I actually did a telecast on that, but I want to say someone may have covered it in a sermon recently. There was someone, and kind of a very popular quote unquote Christian thinker, and I appreciate a modification of his take that I've seen, which is that there's kind of 4 L's that had to apply to Jesus. You had to pick one. You can't take them all, and you got to pick one. One is that either Jesus was a legend, there was no Jesus, so to speak, or his words weren't accurately recorded. But if he was real and his words were accurately recorded, then either that Jesus was a liar or a lunatic, or he actually was the Lord, or he really was, what he claimed to be. And as for the legend thing, maybe we've talked about that before on the podcast, but that is very easy to disprove. There clearly was a very real Jesus Christ. He's attested to even in amongst secular history. And as for his words, the verse that I'd like to turn to talk about this, this comes from the book of John. We found fragments of John that go back to possibly, if you look at, I think it's the Ryland fragment, but possibly within 25 years of when it would have been written. That's astonishing. I mean, that's really close, but you're getting to the time where you're getting to the first few copies of this book, have been made. So, and John is one of those that has the strongest statements about the fact that Jesus really was deity, that he really was God in the flesh. And so then you're really, okay, well, he actually did say these things. Then either he was lying, or he was a lunatic, or he really was God in the flesh. He really was the Lord. Because what are some things he said? Like you go to, say, John chapter 8, and that's where in John chapter 8, he and the Jews around him, they're talking about Abraham. And he says in verse 56, he tells them, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. And it says in verse 57, the Jews said to him, you're not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham. And you can kind of sympathize with him, like, oh, yeah, because you've seen Abraham, 30-something-year-old guy. And then it says in verse 58, Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And that is just a powerful statement. It's
it was not lost on them.
Oh no, it was not. They immediately, in fact, the next verse, they took up stones. They're going to kill him, because it grammatically doesn't fit. When you're choosing to say it, that it would have been still profound to say before Abraham was, I was. I've been around for longer than that. But to actually adopt what is essentially one of the names of God, the I am statement, and to actively use it, even though it doesn't grammatically fit, you're literally making a statement. I am the one who spoke to Moses. I am the one who spoke to Abraham. I am the one that created the world. And that's a bold claim. So a guy that says that, how would you call him a good moral teacher if he's going around calling himself God if he's not? He's either lying or he's delusional, or this actually is who he is. So don't fall for some idea that, you can be a Christian, but man, I don't really accept that Jesus is God. No, the fact is, no, he is God. Yeah, he was when he was there. He is now, and he will be forever. So that's another lie.
Yeah. That's good.
All right.
Good.
We got 2 more. The next one. And that's the idea that Jesus taught tolerance for sin. That we just have to accept each other. And he taught love. And what love means is to really tolerate all this sin and stop being so mean, to all these sinners. I don't know if you ever heard anything like that, Mr. Robinson, but I see it out there in the public. Oh, you Christians, you're so judgy.
Well, I really only heard it cloaked in the idea that there was a God of the Old Testament that was grumpy and judgmental and a little mean and prone to anger, and that Christ came to balance out that God of the Old Testament and to say, hey, everybody, let's relax a little bit. It's not keeping the law is not really what's important. It's just believing in me and that.
Yeah, let's just be nice to everybody and let's love and let's do that.
There's so many shoes that are going to drop when Christ returns, and people, everybody finding out that the God of the Old Testament was the God of the New Testament in a sense, not in a sense, same person.
Right. Nope. It's the kind of Jesus you do see sort of taught from some of these actually mainstream denominations, not all of them, but some of them that have fully embraced homosexuality. Going back to, say, the first idea that, on Pride Month, they're out waving a rainbow flag outside of their cathedral and in different places. This idea that, no, what Jesus, he wanted us all to love each other and get along and to just, so what if your brother and sister does? So what if they're living together and they're not married? So what if, someone is, just why can't we all just get along and tolerate those things? Well, it is true that Jesus dealt with people that were sinners. The Gospels actually use that word pretty blatantly. It's part of what the Pharisees were upset about. He's just surrounded by sinners. Doesn't he know those are sinners? If he knew that was a sinner, he wouldn't go talk to them, because they saw all of them as sinners and they were the righteous ones, instead of realizing, no, you're also a bunch of dirty sinners yourselves. We've all fallen short. But the idea that that to do that is to tolerate their sin and to not actually expect to change, that's really what the lie. Because why do people say that? They'll highlight that Jesus was loving, etc., but what's the subtext of the lie?
Right.
It's that no one should have to change. And the fact that you think what I'm doing is bad makes you a bad person. Jesus wouldn't. He wouldn't tell me what I was doing was bad. He wouldn't tell me I have to change. He would just love me. Well, the fact is, when you're doing something self-destructive, that's part of love, is telling you to change.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point.
Well, the example I picked for this, you might think of a different one, Mr. Robinson, was in John chapter 8, and it's the classic example that some people want to point to, where you had these Pharisees bringing a woman caught in adultery, and they literally say in John chapter 8 and verse 4, she was caught in the very act. Well, if you're caught in the act, that means there was a dude there.
Yeah,
and
where
notice
was
the
he?
dude. Yeah,
Yeah.
where was the dude in all of this? If he didn't join the crowd, let's kill her. Anyway, they bring her to Jesus because hey, we should stone her to death, right? Hey, let's go. It's time to kill this adulteress. What's funny, Jesus didn't say that wasn't the law, but he did put them on a spot to force them to have to think about what is actually the case. So he asked them in verse 7, who is among you, who without sin among you, let him throw the stone at her first. And people talk about him writing in the sand and stuff. I don't really get into that. I find all of that really speculative. But regardless, it does say in verse 9 that they were convicted by their conscience.
Yeah, well, how did Christ refer to them from time to time as an evil and adulterous generation? And so the probability that those men had their own issues is pretty high.
And even if let's say that the guy just didn't get away, they literally let the guy go. Well, they literally committed a sin in that. They're not actually treating them both equally before the law. They're not actually bringing both guilty parties. But yeah, absolutely. They knew, right? It was enough. The circumstances enough that Christ, his words, whether God helped with his spirit, regardless, they knew they were sinful. And so next thing you know, it's just Jesus and the woman. And so in verse 10, it says, Jesus raised himself up and saw no one but the woman. And he said to her, well, woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? And she said, no one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, neither do I condemn you. And that's where they want to stop. They say, oh, that's it. Oh, see, Jesus doesn't condemn you for your sins. But what does he tell her after? He says, go and sin no more. That is literally the only right response to seeing your sins, is to turn yourself and say, you know what, I'm going to stop doing this. I'm going to try to not do this anymore.
That's a common strategy, isn't it? The stop reading strategy.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
Read. Here's the point I want to take away from it. Stop reading. And that there's so many other examples of that in the Bible. And here it is again. It's just like the idea that, was it Peter that actually said, when the jailer responded and he just says, believe in Jesus Christ, as if that is the last thing you have to do. Same kind of concept.
Exactly the same kind of concept. People are what they do is they take God's love and his mercy toward us and turn that into somehow a tolerance for our sin. And that's just not what that is. The Bible has too many examples that make it plain that the expectation is that we would stop sinning, that God's going to show us the truth and that we're going to seek to follow it. So anyway, this idea that, oh no, Jesus, all he did was just come and love everybody. Well, he did love everybody, but you know what? Loving her would be telling her, don't do this anymore, right? Not, oh, don't worry, I don't condemn you either. So go ahead, have another 5 or 6 husbands. What difference does it make? That's actually the opposite of love. That's indifference.
Yeah. I'm just intrigued by how, if you read the rest of the Bible, like the joke about, hey, listen, I read the back of the book. I know we win,
Yeah.
There is no long-term plan to allow sin in the future.
That's right.
So
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. I don't know. I've been thinking about a lot of things lately, and I was struck by the Psalm. I should have looked it up. That just says 50 times. I'm exaggerating. It's probably 20. God's mercy endures forever.
Yes, it's so pleasantly repetitive.
And while His mercy endures forever, His tolerance has limits, and we're all given an opportunity, and there is a time of judgment, and He knows we're not going to get it right, and we're going to be up and down, we're going to make mistakes. Just go read Paul in Romans talking about the struggle. But at the end of the day, you have to overcome it enough that you could be judged. How would you put it, Mr. Smith? We're not perfect, but we're striving towards a complete work.
Yeah. Which, if I get nerdy, I try to say, God's looking at our vector. What direction are we pointed? But there's a difference between someone who doesn't care that they sin versus someone that agonizes over it and is wanting to overcome it. Right? That does make a difference. The guy that went home, the guy that went home justified between the Pharisee and the tax collector, Jesus said, was the one that beat his breast and said, "Have mercy on me, a sinner." Mm-hmm. But truly recognizing you're a sinner would leave you with the desire not to do that again. Right. Whether you find it hard or not, it'd be seeking help. It'd be wanting to overcome. And that's a different attitude than just, it doesn't make a difference.
Right.
Because their version of tolerance really is more of an indifference. You should be indifferent to these things. And the one thing God isn't is indifferent.
No, really, if you do a study truly trying to understand how God feels about sin, you will not come away with the idea that He is tolerant of it.
That's exactly right. And Jesus, of course, of the same mind. All right. Maybe we should move on to the next one.
Final point.
And the next one I find more commonly, especially as, and this one that can actually impact us, those of us who attend the Living Church of God, because we are not in this vein. And that is the idea that Jesus was a political activist, that you saw Him out there. No, he was very much about, tearing down the power structures, and changing the world in that way. And a lot of people are just trying to, and essentially bring Him onto their cause and trying to say that it's wrong for you not to be engaged in politics and to make room for themselves. But it really is kind of funny because that's actually what Jesus' accusers tried to say. They tried to say that He was some kind of active. I wasn't going to turn to these, but let me turn to them for an example. I wrote them down in Luke 23. In Luke 23, for instance, in verse 2, it says they began to accuse Him. This is when He's been arrested, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying he himself is Christ, a king." They're really trying to accuse Him of being very much involved, and trying to say, look, He's trying to say don't pay taxes. When literally you just go back 3 chapters, actually less than 3 chapters because it's later in that one chapter, and it's the opposite. They're trying to get Him to either say, pay taxes and seem like you're betraying your faith, or don't pay taxes, seem like you're betraying Rome. And instead, He gives them the basis of determination, which is, you know what? You pay God what is due to God, and you pay Caesar what is due to Caesar.
Because you know what happens if you don't pay Caesar?
you get Caesar's tax collectors show up. So absolutely, He actually worked within. He said very little about the politicians of the time. He calls Herod a fox, and I was thinking, calling people a fox back then didn't mean quite the same as it does today. But that was only when they brought out Herod, and they said, "Hey, Herod, he's coming to kill you. He's coming to get you." And he says, "Well, you go tell that fox, this temple is going to be destroyed. I'm going to be destroyed. And then in 3 days I'm going to come back." But what he didn't do, he didn't talk about the politics. And Herod was a terrible person, right? I mean, the Herods in general were just they're not the people that you would have normally voted for, say, so to speak, though maybe I guess the Herodians would have, let alone the Romans, right? I think of, they were an occupied people, and you see Jesus out saying, no, this is the Holy Land, we need to get these. He didn't. He focused on the faith and religion of the people and their relationship to God and
Right.
each other.
And nobody really understood that at the time, including his own disciples. I think the best example of that is in the Garden of Gethsemane, where they came to arrest him, and Peter's there, and he's got a sword. Because at that point, we're talking about less than 24 hours from actually being crucified. They still think what Christ is going to do is cast off Roman rule and set up the state of Israel, or whatever it would be called, but restore Israel to the promised land. And that was not at all what he was doing. And him jumping up and swinging with a sword, one of the strongest indicators of he thought this is where this was all going. And a real fundamental misunderstand. Well, not totally. Like they had some insight, but they still didn't understand the grand plan. And the Pharisees, well, to them, this was down with the Pharisees plan. What Christ was doing. They fought tooth and nail to maintain their name and their place. They just wanted to keep their role in society. They wanted to be in charge of everybody. They wanted to appear pious. And Christ was disruptive in that way, because he called them out for their hypocrisy and all those different things, and that they were just putting on a big show. But you're right, politically, he was not trying to do anything like that at all. In fact, when Pilate is condemning him to death, he's like, look, if I wanted to be freed, the angels would come, and legions of angels would
told his
come
disciples
and take care of this.
That's
but
right.
that's not the plan, and I have to go through with this. I mean, what he spoke sharply to Peter, because Peter didn't want him to go through with the dying on the cross and all that kind of thing. But that's one of the primary purposes of him coming to the earth was.
That's right. He, it's interesting in terms of not getting involved. In Luke chapter 12, you have a guy come and say, hey, judge this dispute between me and my brother, about the inheritance. And he says, who appointed me a judge over you? I'm not getting involved. And he literally says to Pilate, you mentioned Pilate earlier in John chapter 18, he says, my kingdom is not of this world. He did not come to reorder this world. Like someone, the chairs on this ship called Titanic, they need to be arranged in a different way. Here's the way those chairs should be.
If only the lounge chairs were over there.
That's right. He came representing a completely different kingdom, and address the faith, the relationships of the people to God, and the relationships of the people to each other, which is really at the heart of the Ten Commandments. And his goal was for all of us to prepare for a kingdom to come. Now, some say, well, that's just an excuse not to get involved. Well, no, believe me, I don't know how you feel, Mr. Robinson, but I'm tempted sometimes to want to really get involved. But you know what? My Savior didn't, and actually called us for a different purpose, and so we're not.
When I was younger, when I was 19, I was more aimless in life, and I was at the mall one day. I don't remember why I was in the mall in the middle of the day. That was not common. And these military recruiters found me playing a video game, and they were trying to recruit me. And I had
You're pretty good at killing things on that game there, son.
Well, you shoot good, boy. And I was actually playing a shooting game. You may have to take that out of the podcast. But anyway, they talked to me for a little while, and it was kind of enticing to go into the military, because you thought it would give you. I thought it would give me a little more purpose and structure. Like I said, I was struggling a little at that age, and the idea that America was great and you could defend it was appealing to me. But fast forward 25 years later, I would not die for my country. What is the trajectory of America that I want to try to save it? It's just corrupt head to toe. I mean, I think one of the more interesting things, and I know people struggle to not think of things through a political lens, but one way or the other, some of the way the money's been used, some of the things that Doge has uncovered about money just unaccounted for, billions and billions and even trillions of dollars unaccounted for. And then the social fabric of our country has never been in worse condition. And it's like, no, I wouldn't sacrifice myself for the country at all. There's nothing here worth saving. And really, big picture, there never was. And I know that's kind of a strong statement, but like Mr. Wakefield used to say, God is not going to rehabilitate man's systems. He's going to replace them. So putting effort into maintaining what God is going to replace is kind of a pointless endeavor.
Right. What they're asking you to do is to kill others and die for. And then that's the question mark. For what? What does that actually mean? Jesus Christ was willing to die, but that was not for, in a sense, to preserve the the going forward of Herod, everything else. Rather, it was to accomplish all the things spiritually that God was trying to do in the world. Again, we don't want to forget to remind you that you can check out Mr. Joe Weston's Tomorrow's World telecast on this topic with 5 completely different kinds of things, exposing 5 myths about Jesus. Talks about, do you pray to Jesus' mom? What do you do? Anyway, go check out that. I'll do my best to make sure there is a link to that on our website. And let's just wrap up briefly by saying Jesus himself said that eternal life was a matter of knowing his Father and knowing him. So knowing him is truly important. And yet the world around us does not know him. It doesn't matter how much they talk about him, how much they use his name, how much they draw pictures of him, or whatever they do not know him. And so sometimes they will lie on purpose. But even when it's innocent, sometimes they still communicate lies because they're talking about someone they don't truly know. Don't fall for the lies. Don't fall for the headlines. Invest your time in knowing the real Jesus Christ. And to end with a recommendation of some sort, it's very easy to start. Open up one of the Gospels and start reading. And as you do, ask him and his Father to help you understand what it is you're reading about him and who he actually is. And then hopefully, if you are baptized, then allow him to work in you now to show you who he is in the ultimate way, which is by living his own life in you. And if you're not yet baptized, that is something that's worth considering, because the ultimate way to get to know him and to know the truth about him is to actually be working with him in that way and having him live his life in you. So don't fall for the lies. The truth is way better.
Sweet